Welcome back to Ambivalent Offenders. This is Erin, and I am joined again by my husband, the one, the only, the smartest man I know, Matt. Hi, Matt.
Well, then you need to get around and meet some new people.
No.
Thank you. Hey, everybody.
Before we jump in to talk more about Mary Todd Lincoln, I will ask, as always, if you enjoy this podcast, please tell your friends about it. Like, rate, subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. We really appreciate it. It helps our ego and also helps people find the podcast.
Oh, and I need to send out a special message to anyone from the Federal Triangle, from Washington, D.C., from the Northern Virginia, Maryland corner of the country. An error correction.
Uh-oh.
The Patreon episode that we did about John Wilkes Booth and his escape, his ill-fated escape into the South, I misspoke. I had him going across the Navy Yard Bridge, across the Potomac, and that's the old Navy Yard Bridge would take you in Maryland, takes you across the Anacostia, which is a little tributary of the Potomac. So I'm sure there's somebody out there who was all ready to push their glasses up against the bridge of their nose.
They were going to actually us.
Actually, I knew it like the moment I said it, I was like, wait a minute, I used to go there every summer, and that's not exactly
I had no idea.
where you would.
I had no idea.
So there's a little geographic mea culpa on my part. I'm sorry about that.
That's okay.
But we're done with that story.
We collectively forgive you.
Yeah, we're back to focusing on Mary, who deserves some attention. She hasn't gotten the focus that she deserves.
And just one more note, I promise, before we get into Mary's story, I am not going to dive into the ins and outs of the Civil War. That could fill an entire podcast backlog on its own. There are plenty of podcasts out there that talk just about the war. I will mention it as needed, but if you're expecting this to be Civil War focused, might not be the podcast for you. So just a heads up. Not talking about battles today, at least not battles on the battlefield. Say that. We ended our last episode with Abraham Lincoln's demoralizing defeat in the Senate race against Stephen Douglas. I know we did give a little bit of background on how he lost this battle, but ultimately won the war, so to speak. I guess before we do take Mary into the White House, do you want to give us a little bit of background on the 1860 election? We already mentioned Lincoln was a dark horse in the race. I don't know if there's any other background you want to give listeners about that election before we get him on the way to the White House.
I don't think we really need to do that much. He is not considered to be a favorite going into the
It's Seward,
nominating
right?
convention.
Seward?
Right. Seward from New York is thought to be. I think there was a lot of speculation that Lincoln might be the vice president. I do think it's important to point out, though, that there is a tendency, we do this with a lot of the faces on Mount Rushmore, we tend to make Lincoln sort of grandfatherly and passive and very reluctant to pursue power. You know, this is not a man of ambition. This is not a man who's drawn to status or influence, or he's not seeking power. He just feels like the moment calls him. And that's not true. He is ambitious. If you look at some of the insider trading that goes on in the Chicago convention, although the candidates themselves have to stay far away from the convention site, it's unseemly if you actually appear at the convention.
And the convention in these days they're trying to sort out the nominee. It's not just like nowadays. It's a big party. We know who it's going to be going in. They're actually trading and dealing and trying to figure that out here.
Right. Since probably the mid-'60s, really, our conventions are more kind of pageants. They're more coronations. But even now, we sort of honor this fiction where, although it's been broken by both parties, but you may know the ritual of the convention, even today, is that the actual candidate doesn't show up until the last night.
Yeah.
Well, in the 19th century, you weren't even supposed to attend, period. You were supposed to pretend when the telegram arrived, oh my, the people want me to be the candidate. I'm so honored. And we're moving past that by the 1850s. Seward's back in New York. He's pretending that he's not following events closely. But Lincoln's not far away. This is kind of his home turf. He does do some things, or at least his backers, his supporters do some things that we might today consider to be a little bit on the margins of ethical conduct. There's a lot of evidence that passes to the convention were forged.
Oh,
And that Lincoln's people would get in, and whenever the vote was pending for one of the upper tier candidates, that suddenly they would break out in song. Have you considered Mr. Lincoln? He's the rail splitter. They would break up the vote.
good strategy.
So we are in the convention hall.
Wheeling and dealing.
Right. And one of the advantages Lincoln has, and I think we did talk about this in the last episode, but a lot of the other candidates within the Republican Party have history. They have baggage. They've been in Washington for all of these contentious debates about the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the Compromise of 1850 and which part of the country is going to get its transcontinental route advanced in Congress. They've got a history that makes them potentially unpalatable to not so much the northern votes. Everybody in the Republican Party knows they're probably not going to struggle to take a Vermont. They know they're not going to struggle in New England. And they also know that they're not going to be on the ballot in Mississippi or Texas or Alabama. But the question is, can you pull down a Kentucky or an Indiana or a Missouri or an Illinois? Can you pull in an Ohio, right? Can you grab the upper South or the Midwest, I guess, is what we would call it. And Lincoln's sort of ideally suited to that just by virtue of his own biography.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, he's got zero baggage, good biography, which even now, in terms of politics, that's great. That's how you win elections. So it's not surprising that he's able to pull it off. And then you also talked about how the Democrats were divided between Stephen Douglas, and then there was another Southern Democrat, correct?
Yeah, John Breckinridge, who campaigned on a platform of Mexican-American War Part 2, More Manifest Destiny.
We didn't manifest our destiny far enough. We need to keep it up.
Right. Breckinridge tends to carry the Deep South. And then there's actually a third party, the Constitution and Union Party.
And it's led by Ralph Nader.
I know you're thinking, shouldn't Ralph Nader be there?
I just assumed he always showed up anytime there was some sort of consequential election.
I tell you what, though, it's always jarring for students of 19th century American history because they get accustomed to seeing electoral maps that are blue and red, end of story. Now, the colors themselves have shifted around a lot. In fact, I'm probably dating myself here, but I can remember in the 70s, late 70s, early 80s, it was often red Democrat, blue Republican.
Oh, really?
Of course, this was also before color TV in some cases.
So it didn't really matter.
Yeah, this dark gray over here is Eisenhower.
Gray, dark gray, medium gray.
Yeah. Not that I remember the Eisenhower elections, but my parents certainly do. Anyway, the problem then for kids is they'll look at these maps from like 1860 and they'll see Breckinridge in green, or they'll see Bell in yellow.
Green Party.
Right. And they'll go, is that the Green Party? Well, no. But they are kind of green in the sense that it's the upper South. It's places like North Carolina that are drawn to that movement because I think they know that if there's going to be a catastrophe, if there's going to be a long, drawn-out, ugly civil war, they're going to be right in the middle of it.
Yeah. And my favorite story about election night, by the way, is that when Abraham Lincoln learned via the telegraph office that he had won, he said, I guess there's a little lady at home who would like to hear this news. And it said as he went home, he called, Mary, Mary, we are elected, which she would have seen it that way. She always felt his wins were hers and his losses were hers, too.
Oh, absolutely. Right. They are a political couple, and she's always aspired to be a person of influence and status. And
Exactly.
Her star is rising as his does.
And she had always felt that he was going to be the president. She told him he didn't believe it, but she always believed it. And now it was actually happening. Even with her husband being the president-elect, Mary still hoped to continue to be his closest advisor. Before Mary got to the White House, though, she had some shopping to do. So in January of 1861, she headed to New York City. If she was going to be First Lady, she needed a wardrobe to match, especially as some newspapers had made some snide comments about her quote-unquote Western vulgarity, according to the book. To go back to the first episode, if I'm quoting anything, it will be Mary Todd Lincoln, a biography by Jean Baker. Mary really wanted to put her best foot forward, or to have that foot adorned with the highest fashion that would endear her to the ladies in Washington and the press. She spent 2 weeks in New York City by herself, and she loved the attention that she got wherever she went because she was the wife of the future president. At the heart of it, this is the attention that she always felt she deserved. It would make her petty when she felt that she was not being treated as the incoming First Lady. For example, when the State Line Railroad dared to charge her for her ticket back to Springfield, she made a fuss enough that Robert, her eldest son, said, quote, "The old lady is raising hell about her passes."
Oh.
So she's already feeling entitled to some things, which would not change. And Mary's keen eye for fashion and that easy Southern charm did serve the president-elect well. Mary, she's 42, and her children, they made for a good public image for Abraham Lincoln. On the way to D.C. from Springfield via train, they'd stop and they're put on display. At every stop, everyone wanted to see Tad, Willie, and the missus. They'd say, "Abe, show us the missus." Initially, Mary and the children, they weren't supposed to be on the train as the nation careened towards civil war, threats against the president-elect Lincoln and his family only increased once South Carolina seceded from the Union in December of 1860. Do you want to give a quick little spiel of what's happening as they're heading towards the Capitol?
Well, the Deep South secedes first. So South Carolina leaves the Union in December of 1860.
Mm-hmm.
And then you see states like Texas and Florida follow suit. The Upper South, so this would be North Carolina, Virginia, they don't leave until Fort Sumter, which is April of 61. But you need to remember that during the 19th century and a good part of the 20th century, new presidents don't come into office in January.
March.
It's March. So it's basically a month into his term that what we would consider the Civil War starts. On his way into D.C., if you think back to a previous episode we did about the robber barons, he does have Pinkerton detectives on the train with him, including one of their first female employees.
Oh, really?
Kate Warren, who's trying to keep him safe because Maryland in particular, there's a real anxiety. Well, there's going to be a real anxiety throughout the first 2 or 3 years of the war that Maryland will secede from the Union. And in an immediate sense, that's a problem because then you have to wonder, will there be some sort of Confederate attack on the train itself?
Yeah, that's what they were really worried. So when they get to Harrisburg, Lincoln, he goes apart from the family and he takes his own night train to get from Harrisburg to Baltimore. And actually, when Mary's on that train, she and presumably the kids have this frightful experience because men in Baltimore, there's kind of like a mob. They do come aboard the train looking for, and this is upsetting, but this is what they're looking for, quote, "the black ape," end quote.
Yep.
So they were looking for the president. I don't think those fears were unfounded.
Right. He's disguised in a soft cap and a shawl and put on a separate rail car.
Mm-hmm.
And then during the other part that's bizarre about the early weeks of his administration is that Congress is missing half of its southern members.
Yep.
They're not really sure, well,
What do we do?
how can we conduct business? Meanwhile, if you look at any map, you can realize if Maryland does leave the Union after Fort Sumter, like Virginia does, then suddenly Washington, D.C. is going to become surrounded. I know we're not going to talk much about the war, but this will be one of the first things Lincoln does that draws Mary out to defend him. But it's a constitutionally dubious maneuver on his part. Article 1 of the Constitution says that habeas corpus privileges can be suspended in time of rebellion, insurrection. But Article 1 defines the powers of Congress. Lincoln goes ahead and suspends it by executive order to try and get Confederate sympathizers off the tracks. So we don't want to go too far down into the weeds of this. It's not a constitutional law podcast, and it's another area where I am not an expert. But the habeas corpus protection, the fundamental principle of it is that if you can be tossed in a cell, if the government can just disappear you
With no due process?
with no due process, then nothing else matters, right? But I have a right to an attorney, and I have a right to a jury trial,
But
and I have a right to
do you?
confront my witnesses. But if when your family or your attorney, knocks on the federal marshal's door and says, well, where's my husband? And the government says, well, who's your husband? It's like, oh, well, it's Matthew. Or, well, who's Matthew? Right? I mean, if they don't have to answer that question, then none of your other rights and protections really matter. So it's an incredibly significant.
And controversial.
Right. Now, in his defense, Congress, as soon as they do come back into session, they authorize the suspension.
But do they authorize it thinking like, well, it's already done? At that point, could they really put up a fight?
Well, and it raises another issue that kind of circles back to a previous discussion we've had about the assassination, which is when habeas corpus is suspended, if civilians are taken into custody by the government, does the suspension of habeas corpus authorize military authorities to detain civilians? And eventually, this will be after Lincoln's death, this will be after the Civil War, the court will hold that if the civilian judicial machinery is in operation, if the courthouse is not on fire, then you as a citizen, as a civilian, should not be dragged in front of a court-martial or a military tribunal or an admiralty court. You should be subject to the normal protections of civil and criminal due process. Now, in the event that that's not the case and the courthouse is in ashes, then, then they have to have a different conversation, right? But that's going to be something that will kind of dog Lincoln early on. Mm-hmm. And again, it's not something we usually focus on, but it's something, Mary's aware of this, is that he's kind of trapped in this weird vice where the war's not going well, at least in the East for the North. So he's perceived as passive and ineffective as a commander-in-chief. But at the same time, he's got to deal with these accusations that he's a tyrant.
Yeah, overstepping. We also talked about him at the end of the war being so worn down. The very look of his face, part of it's the war, but probably also the fact that you're not pleasing anybody.
Yeah, there's nothing he can do.
It all comes back to this.
No matter what he does, someone's going to see him as the enemy.
Yeah, but I do think it's important that even with these threats, she's adamant. She wants to be at her husband's side as he makes his way to the White House. And even when she gets there, there are plenty of times that people are telling her, it'd probably be safer to be elsewhere, but she wants to be at his side. Especially here, it's her victory as much as his, at least in her eyes. So she really wants to be on the train. And she is the star of the show, although their young sons also won hearts with 10-year-old Willie. He would come out and he would bow and wave to the adoring crowds that had come out to see the new presidential family. People have always been drawn to the appeal of a wholesome family, and this fit the bill. The crowd would go wild when Mary would smooth her husband's hair. He'd bend down and she'd straighten it out. People love those little gateways into a family's or a couple's private life. And Mary, always longing to be appreciated, got some of the best praise she would ever get with her ability to talk to anyone. The Home Journal would call her the, quote, Illinois Queen. But again, like you said, for all the goodwill, the risk against the Lincoln family could not be ignored. We already talked about the Baltimore incident. So it's this mix of they're getting ushered in with goodwill, but also there's real threats going on and the looming war. When she arrived in Washington, Mary planned to host tea parties as a further sign of goodwill in a country growing more divided by the day. However, kind of like you said, many declined her invitations because not only were there a segment of people gone to the Confederacy, but a large segment of Washington society still held Southern sympathies, even if they weren't officially part of the Confederacy. These people didn't want to necessarily be seen palling around with Mrs. Lincoln. Many of these women happily gossiped about the new First Lady. While Mary Todd Lincoln had been somebody in Lexington, we talked about how the Todds had the run of the town, and even Springfield, she had been one of the leading ladies of the town. Washington was different. She was essentially a nobody from a backwater state. You mentioned in the first episode about how a person from South Carolina or Virginia wouldn't think highly of somebody from Kentucky, even if you were Kentucky royalty.
Very true. And it's also the case that during this period, kind of adding to the complexity of it all, Kentucky itself is incredibly important for Lincoln to the outcome of the Civil War. It's probably apocryphal, but there's a story told that a group of ministers came to the White House and assured Lincoln that, their own prayer had brought them to the conclusion that God was on their side. And then Lincoln, in his own imagination, hears them say, God is on our side. God is with the Union. And I think in his head, he draws this little map and he's like, okay, well, I've got some states here. Missouri, that is a legal slave state, but has not seceded. And if I lose Missouri, I lose the upper Mississippi.
Yeah.
If I lose Kentucky, I lose control of the Ohio River. And if I lose Maryland, then the Union capital becomes surrounded by Confederate territory. So allegedly, he politely responds back, I really appreciate the help of the Almighty, but what I need right now is Kentucky. If you could give me a Missouri and a Kentucky and a Maryland, that would really... It's great to have God's help.
Even if that's not true, that sounds like something he would have said.
Yeah, you could totally imagine him saying it after they walked out of the room.
Well, yeah. Mary, she did her best, though, to weather the disrespect and the threats for more violence on Inauguration Day. Nothing would keep her away from seeing her husband installed as president. So she was one of the 30,000 people who watched Abraham Lincoln take his oath of office and become president. And, of course, in a blue silk gown and plenty of jewelry, including new diamonds, Mary attended the inaugural ball surrounded by many of her Todd relatives. According to custom, she was not supposed to dance with her husband, which she hated. She was like, I just want to dance with my hubby. You were supposed to dance with somebody else. So in a full circle moment, it would be Stephen Douglas, who she would dance with at the inaugural ball, which it was the Democrats' Douglas's way of showing support for the new First Lady.
Right. And he's a Union Democrat. He does not support secession.
Yes. And he knows that much of Washington society is ready to exclude her. So he's taken one for the team. For Mary, it probably meant more. To quote the book, quote, Mary Lincoln may have seen it differently. For her, the occasion demonstrated her prescience in choosing a president years ago between two insistent suitors, end quote. So she's like, I chose the right guy. I am dancing with this man, but my husband, he's president. She had chosen the better man in her eyes. While her husband retired at midnight, Mary danced and socialized into the wee hours of the morning. Whatever the Washington ladies thought of her, the New York Herald sang her praises, saying that she was, quote, more self-possessed than Lincoln and has accommodated more readily than her taller half to the exalted station to which she has been so strangely advanced from the simple social life of the little inland capital of Illinois, unquote. I like her taller half. Instead of my better half, I'm going to say you're my taller half.
Well, I'm not certainly Lincoln's height.
Well, you're taller than me, so you are my taller half. And I really hope that Mary enjoyed these initial days as First Lady, despite the looming war, despite everything, because they would be, in a lot of ways, the high watermark. Her popularity could and would only decrease from then on. Mary's visibility in the White House would become a liability for the Lincoln administration and her own reputation. Some of that had nothing to do with her own behavior. Her immediate predecessors had been virtually invisible. That was not Mary. That was never going to be Mary. So she would have the misfortune of being the First Lady to be truly visible as a public figure, not just the president's wife. Being the first of something usually opens women up to more ridicule and scrutiny. Unlike her predecessors, Mary really wanted to be seen. The book presents it in a way that Mary's insecurity, born out of her childhood, made her have a desire for attention, for notoriety. I don't think I would disagree with that assessment, yet as a public figure, a celebrity whose life was constantly in the newspapers, Mary's notoriety did not bring her praise or admiration. It mostly brought her frustration, anger, and heartbreak. It's the cycle that Mary needed attention. Her need for attention meant in a lot of ways she followed the mantra, any press is good press. If she was being talked about, that must have meant that she was important. And Mary wanted to be important. But she really hated reading the bad things about her, the press. So it's just like this endless cycle that she would do things and then the press would cover them poorly and she would be angry. Rinse, repeat. Mary was a woman of contradictions at the heart of it. She looked down upon trailblazing women who became part of the public eye, like those who would lead the suffragette or the abolition movements. But she was conservative with a lowercase c, about women's rights. She never wanted to be seen as a woman stepping outside of the domestic sphere, even if she did it all the damn time. For example, when the New York Times compared her to Queen Elizabeth I, saying that Mary was, quote, making and unmaking fortunes of men, end quote. Mary hated that. She was so angry. But however Mary thought women were supposed to behave, she never really followed it herself. Perhaps the biggest controversy for Mary Todd Lincoln in the White House is her spending. Sure, you know this. From the time her husband took office to our modern day, the money issue has followed Mary. In some ways, fairly, and in other ways, not so much. It might have been easier to overlook in a different era, but as the nation went to war against itself, the spending of high sums on dresses and renovating the White House appeared really extravagant. It was a PR nightmare in the making. To be fair to Mary, and I'm sure you know this, the White House really did need a makeover. They had wallpaper peeling off the walls, furniture hadn't been replaced in many administrations beforehand. So I don't know if you know anything about what the White House looked like at that time, but from what it sounds like, it wasn't necessarily a great place to live.
No, it was falling apart, and it would have to go through renovations 2 or 3 more times before it, comes to look like
what we would expect it.
What we know today.
Mm-hmm.
The other, I think, important variable in her approach to being First Lady is that she comes to see state dinners as sort of formalistic and aloof and, ironically, not what the public would want to see during the austerity and trauma of war. So instead, they start doing these large receptions.
Yep.
and balls.
which she loved. We'll talk about some of those. I'll talk about later that at one she was like, I'm going to shake the hand of every person who's in here. And she almost got it. She almost did it.
Yeah, and I think that's what's going to start to create a lot of tension between her and the press, in addition to the tension that she already has with Lincoln's cabinet and with his two most prominent secretaries who come to have some really unpleasant nicknames for her. They call her Your Majesty under their breath.
Loren.
Loren, the Hellcat.
Yes, yeah. It seems like a majority of the people, the men who surrounded Abraham Lincoln, were not her biggest fans.
Right. Part of it, too, is her background and her education has put her in a position to have observations, to have opinions about politics and about public life, and their own worldview just isn't, it's not attuned to see that as legitimate. She's trying to kind of skirt this weird margin of, well, I also know that as a woman, it's unseemly for me to dirty my hands in politics.
When she butts in, she is always apologizing and saying, as a woman, I know I shouldn't be doing this, but that doesn't mean she stops.
Right.
She doesn't stop the letter there. Then she continues. It's this push-pull where she looks down upon women who are doing this, but she can't help herself. Back to the money, there had been a $20,000 allowance for each administration to update, redecorate the White House. That would be over the course of 4 years. But that money was often left on the table or pocketed without anything done to the actual White House. That also was a thing. So it was not just a need to spend or a desire to live in decadence that drove Mary into overdrive redoing the White House. I do think we have to give her that. It did need quite a bit of work after having been neglected for years. Plus, Mary rightfully understood that the White House was not just a home for the president and his family, but it was symbolic to the nation. It would not do for President Lincoln to live in dilapidated rooms. So, while her husband worked to put a divided nation together, Mary went to work turning the White House into something closer to what we'd recognize today, as we already said. At this time, too, we also mentioned a little bit earlier, there were real threats to Mary along with her husband, including one to kidnap the family and the president's cabinet. So that threat had been reported in May of 1861, so just months after President Lincoln took office in March of 1861. While many women and families left the Capitol fearing it would become a war zone, Mary refused. She wanted to stay. She wanted to stay by her man. She believed in him. She believed in the Union. She wanted to do her cause. She was never one to back away from a fight. Instead, though, she went north to New York and Philadelphia to go shopping for the White House, accompanied by the acting commissioner of public buildings, William Wood, who Mary had actually requested specially for the job. Do you know William Wood?
I don't know a lot about William Wood.
Okay, so they had met him. He had helped organize the train ride from Springfield to Washington. So it was a relatively new friendship, but they got along well, obviously enough for her to want him to have the job. And it was William Wood's job to supervise the spending of the money for the redecoration. And that would be a big job, an unenviable job. It would be like you supervising my purchases at Sephora.
That would be a challenge for me.
It would be an impossibility. And Mary's close friendship to William Wood also sent tongues wagging. There were rumors that the relationship was more than platonic, enough that it got back to Mary's husband. One of the White House secretaries spoke about, quote, the war Mary Lincoln had with Mr. Lincoln about the commissioner. They scarcely spoke together for several days. It impressed me painfully, but I suppose such scenes were rare, end quote. I don't want to say that there was something going on with William Wood, but especially after she went to New York and Philadelphia accompanied by him, it made for something of a scandal, regardless of the truth of the relationship. And I honestly don't think she was romantically involved with him.
The only thing I know about Wood is, if memory serves, because it very quickly, she spent more than Lincoln's entire salary.
You're getting ahead of me, but yes, the $20,000, she uses the 4 years, $20,000 in 1 year and then over.
And it's hidden partly in his budget. There's a landscaping budget.
Yep, I'll get to that.
Here's something else, though. Throughout this time period, in the War Department in particular, this kind of graft, this kind of misrepresentation of funds, it happens all the time. It's wrong, especially when there's a war going on. But it's not like she's doing anything that isn't happening all over the place, north and south.
I think that's important to point out.
When the government tells you, oh, we need 800,000 boots by next Tuesday, right?
Where are you getting that money?
There's a lot of opportunity there for corruption.
Yeah, I agree. Back to William Wood. I don't think she was having an affair with him because it seems pretty clear that she really only had eyes for Abraham. But she did like to flirt and use her charms, so I'm sure that fed into the rumors. Mary's choice of shopping location in New York also revealed poor political judgment because it deprived the local D.C. merchants and stores of the thousands of dollars that Mrs. Lincoln was spending. Her spending might have been easier to swallow if she was spending in D.C. It's like, I'm going to use this example. If somebody was talking about how we should bring goods back to America, but then they were creating their own products in China, for example, that would be bad.
That would seem intellectually inconsistent to you.
It would be bad optics, right?
Yeah, that's a hard thing for me to relate to.
I know. I'm just throwing it out there. Not that that's anything that's happening. Mary was good at politics. She should have known better. I fully believe that. And reporters followed her every move while she was in New York and Philadelphia and gossiped about how she liked to carry whatever she bought back to the hotel instead of waiting for it to be delivered, which I sympathize with. I don't like waiting for things to be delivered. I like instant gratification as well. She returned to New York twice in 1861 alone for shopping sprees and 11 times throughout her time as First Lady.
Do you want the inflation-adjusted numbers?
Wait, let's get to that when I talk, because I'm going to talk about some numbers.
It's not for the faint of heart.
I'm going to get to the numbers. I do want to say that despite the gossip and rumors, her upgrade of the White House did receive compliments. Even her critics talked about how much better it looked. This is where you're like, what's the problem? She was given money to upgrade the White House. What's the big deal? Well, we already kind of spoiled that Mary did not quite stick to the budget. So the next question will be, how much should Mary spend? We don't know the full amount because she covered her ass, we'll say. But yes, we do know that she spent in less than 1 year the $20,000 that was supposed to last all 4 years. And not just that, but the supplemental $6,000 that was meant for repairs to the White House. So she's got at least $26,000 just there.
So what I'm showing, I can take you through the laundry list here. Do you have one too?
Well, there's a china set and wallpaper accounted for over $10,000 together.
Right. That's French wallpaper.
Yep.
Purchased in New York. Rugs and curtains at $2,000.
China's like a couple thousand.
About $3,000. Right. There's the silverware, carpeting, wallpaper. It all... grand total.
Okay, so you have a total, because they said that we didn't quite know, but...
Well, it's an estimate because things like the cut glass tableware, that's a 700-piece set, and no one's ever been able, it looks like, to appraise it. But the estimate I'm seeing from what looks like a relatively...
I'm scared.
Reputable...
I'm getting heart palpitations.
Would be adjusted for $2,025. This would be the spending for fiscal 61, 62. $1.2 million.
No.
Which even today would probably, well, I don't know.
To be fair, I'm sure the White House, I'm sure spends way more than that for upkeep, but it's not the first lady doing the shopping nowadays. You get less blowback in that way, but it's not great.
Right. And it sets them up for these really cutting newspaper editorials.
Yes, it makes its way to the press. She's becoming a lightning rod for a still really young administration.
It's got to be really hard for Lincoln to deal with this on top of all of the other criticism that he's taking.
Yeah, and he's obviously occupied in military matters. He's trying to manage the war at this point. So it does take him a while to find out. He eventually does find out how much he had overspent, but it takes a bit to get back to him.
Right. So, like, here's a classic. I think this is a pretty good example of what they're dealing with. This is from the Cincinnati Gazette. It says 600,000 of the youth of America are now enduring the monotonous hardships of the camp or wasting by disease to save their country from destruction. Throughout the North, families are living in continual apprehension of news that a husband, son, father, or brother has been killed. All over the country, associations of women are laboring to provide comforts to mitigate the hardships of our soldiers. And in this hour of national distress, the account of a splendid ball at the White House jars upon the sensibilities of the country.
Yeah.
I'm going to push back, though, and say something I don't think gets enough attention, which is Lincoln is not a Washington insider. And the people in his cabinet, Secretary of State Seward, Secretary of the Treasury Chase, his Attorney General Bates, these are all rivals for the Republican nomination.
A team of rivals, would you say?
Right, exactly, as Doris Kearns Goodwin would put it. And he knows that he needs congressional support because he's a coalition president. He's going to have to keep Union Democrats under the tent. He's going to have to hold on to those border states like Kentucky and Missouri. He needs radicals in the party like Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner to support him, but he also needs moderates. So he needs the White House to be a place that is kind of a hub.
Yeah. It's not a let them eat cake moment.
No.
They need the socialization. And yeah, Mary does become very territorial when it comes to other people throwing parties like the Sewards. She feels like they need to consolidate power, if you want to think about it that way. And parties are part of that.
Right. This is how they're going to interface with the machinery of government. On some level, she's doing something that's very important for his success, even though she's obviously spending more than she probably should. Yeah,
I think the book talks about how they hadn't spent needlessly because the White House needed it, but, quote, hastily, expensively, and tastefully. So it's like, maybe you don't get the $6,000 wallpaper. Maybe you go for the $3,000 wallpaper. I did love that when Lincoln does finally find out, he confronts Mary for what he called her, quote, flubadubs. Can you use that when you're mad at me? If I ever make a mistake, don't say it's a mistake.
Say it's a flubadub, huh?
Flubadub, yeah.
Oh, I'll try to remember that. Well, I've probably made some flubadubs.
Yeah. But he knows that the spending spree was going to embarrass them all. Mary does try to tell him that, quote, in truth, I have had to be as economical as possible, more so than I had ever before in my life, which this is again where I'm like, I don't think $6,000 wallpaper counts as a deal, but I get what you're trying to say. And then this is where Lincoln even threatened to pay the White House bills from his own salary, which Mary's like, we can't afford to do that because they're not rolling in money when they come into the White House. And we'll talk about here in a bit about what else they'd have to spend the money on. It's a point of contention in their marriage and in the government. We will say that. Eventually, the whole scandal is going to taint Mary and her friend, William Wood, enough that he's out of a job because he was just the acting commissioner, and the Senate's not going to confirm him after this. So the job goes to Benjamin French. He arrives at work with a stack of unpaid bills and a lot of angry creditors. And this is where Mary and French, they found those sort of sneaky ways to hide her overspending, reassigning money from other accounts to go towards the White House. The gardener padded the books and would pass along money to Mary. In the campaign of 1864, which is ahead, so we're jumping a little bit ahead, but there were rumors that the Democrats would use Mary's spending as a campaign issue. There were many around the president who worried that those who Mary still owed money to would expose her huge pile of unpaid bills and the true cost of her clothing, which we will get to. That's not to say that Mary didn't try to pinch pennies where she could. She even had a sale of old White House furniture, and she sold the manure from the stables, which, as you can imagine, led to quite a lot of jokes, especially as people said that she inflated the cost of it. Just selling overpriced manure. The jokes write themselves.
They do.
Mary's spending does read as excessive, although, again, I do want to point out that the Lincolns were not exactly rolling in money when they came into the White House. And once they were there, they were in charge of paying the servants and any entertaining that they did. So when they held these parties, they would have to pay for it themselves, which cost a lot of money, as Mary would find out. She'd cut staff to save some money, but presidents usually left the White House a lot poorer than they went in, which is, I think, something that nowadays modern people can't quite understand. That in this day and age, you have to have a huge amount of money just to run for the presidency.
Yeah.
And then when you come out, you're usually not strapped for cash.
Right. But in the 19th century, you usually are.
Yes. But Mary, she did always seem to find money for what she wanted. I will say that. Whether it was decor or dresses, she employed the freedwoman Elizabeth or Lizzie Keckley as her seamstress. And Keckley churned out dress after dress. Keckley has a very interesting life story, and I really wish we could get more into it because it's fascinating, but I'm trying to stick to Mary, and I know we've got a lot to get through, but people should look up Lizzie Keckley's story. She also dressed, strangely, Jefferson Davis's wife. Seems quite strange, but
Small world.
Yeah. Keckley would become one of Mary's closest friends in the White House, especially later when the two bonded over spiritualism. Like the White House, Mary, she really just wanted to put her best self on display. Mary looked to Empress Eugenie, who was the wife of Napoleon III in France, for example. Despite Eugenie being quite a bit younger than the 40-something-year-old Mary, Mary would actually be made fun of for wearing styles that were deemed too young for her. Her friend, Mercy Levering, one of her first friends in Springfield that we talked about in that first episode, she even called her, quote, "Our Royal Highness" behind her back. And you already mentioned Lincoln's secretaries calling her La Reine, a.k.a. the Queen. So with her royal taste, but not quite royal budget, Mary had amassed about $10,000 of debt by 1865, stuck in a cycle of spending to keep her creditors at bay, which only added to the bills. If I order a few more dresses or a few more curtains, maybe they won't come for me. I just think that the public never understood Mary's intent with her wardrobe. They didn't see it as her representing the nation with elegance and fashion, something Jackie Kennedy would be celebrated for 100 years later. So I do think we do need to point that out, that is it because of the time, you're in a civil war, you want to be economical, but also is it because she's a 40-something-year-old, she doesn't have the, body of a model that Jackie Kennedy has. I don't know why people make fun of Mary for this when we praise other people for representing their nation through their wardrobe.
I do know that she's ultimately going to come, well, at least the speculation is, but it's pretty informed speculation. I don't want to jump ahead to something here that you may be about to deliver, but when Willie dies, there's some historical speculation that she sees that as God punishing her.
Mm-hmm. Yep, I will talk about that.
I should be quiet and let you get there. But I would just back up and say that, again, in her defense, we think of the United States today as a superpower and a nation that commands enormous respect internationally. But in 1861 and 62, there's a very strange dynamic unfolding with the British and French diplomatic corps that is routinely going in and out of the White House, which is like at the 30,000 foot level in the abstract, just kind of looking at the United States as a relatively new nation in the world, especially relative to Britain and France. We're a republic, and we're going through this internal crisis. And under their breath, you can imagine the French, who by that point have kind of reverted back to a more autocratic governmental structure.
They have an emperor, the nephew of Napoleon, aka Napoleon III.
And Britain's a constitutional monarchy, but it's an emphasis on constitution, but it's still a monarchy. And it still has a really rigid class structure.
Queen Victoria's the monarch at this point, so she's very, very public. In a lot of ways, Mary, she's looking to Eugenie, but she's also looking to Victoria as sort of an example.
And so I think as a consequence of that, she wants the White House and all the events that take place there to look dignified, to look worthy of a nation that's aspiring to greatness.
Yeah, she wants them to step it up. She's stepping it up in terms of her fashion, in terms of the White House. I don't think that's a bad thing.
And then at the same time, she's got that whole, Kentucky is not blue blood Virginia, but it's not the hill country of Tennessee either. There's a sort of striving Southern identity there. That's, of course, tormented by the fact that a little too much Southern identity makes you look treasonous.
That's suspicious.
And members of her own family are fighting for the other side.
Yep, which we will talk about.
Again, I understand why we've all done it. You haven't had the best day at work. You're headed home and you need some toilet paper, maybe a couple of AA batteries, and then you see some other things in the store and you're like, well.
Sometimes the stores also make you buy cookies if you want to buy toilet paper.
In my experience, sometimes you can't get what you want. They'll just say, you have to buy some Pepperidge Farm cookies with this toilet paper or we won't let you out of the store.
I've never had it happen.
I know it's never happened to you, but it happens to me all the time.
It does.
And, no, I'm not spending $1.3 million on them, but.
Yeah. A part of it, I think, is also like she's dressing for the job that she wants. I understand where she's coming from, but I also understand the critiques. And people are making fun of her because she's a woman from Springfield. They don't really know her heritage, that she's the blue blood from Lexington, Kentucky. So they're like, oh, she's dressing like royalty. She's putting on airs. There are also others who disliked the stylish showing of shoulders and décolletage. I do have this quote from the senator from Oregon, James Nesmith. He recounted a visit to the White House and said that Mary, quote, had her bosom on display, a flower pot on her head, end quote. So I think he's talking about she liked to wear florals in her hair. Nastily, so that wasn't even the worst of it. He remarked that she, quote, used to cook old Abe's dinner and milk the cows, and now she exhibits her milking apparatus to public gaze.
Oh, gosh, that's just harsh.
Yeah. James, you do not talk about boobs that way. There are not milking apparatuses. 2, I want everybody to look up James Nesmith, Oregon. I just looked him up when I was doing this. He should be the last person to talk about someone's looks, if you catch my drift. So James Nesmith, your ghost. If you're on the spiritual plane, I want you to hear it from me. He might not be able to hear me through the massive mutton chops glued to his face.
James, if you can hear us, knock 3 times.
His hair also looks like his mother cut it. I'm going to send you a picture right now. Or just look it up, James Nesmith.
I'm pulling him up. Now, you do have to be careful because Google's going to assume that you're trying to find out about the history of basketball, and that's not what we're looking for. That's a
different.
That's Naismith.
Yes.
We're looking for
Nesmith.
And he's, wow.
Those mine chops. That's why I was like, I don't think he can hear me through the mine chops.
Yeah.
Even if I'm saying something mean, unfortunately.
The top of his head indicates that.
Is it a toupee? I can't tell.
Either that or he's just really letting it go because he's trying to compensate for the
mutton chops?
The male pattern baldness. Potentially.
I don't know. I was like, something's going on up top, and I don't love it. To counteract the nastiness, Abraham Lincoln, he commented once on his wife's plunging neckline saying, "Woo, our cat has a long tail tonight. If some of that tail was nearer the head, it would be in better style." End quote.
Oh, we're getting pretty catty here.
Well, that was more sweet. He would also say that, quote, "My wife is as handsome as when she was a girl, and I, a poor nobody then, fell in love with her and once more have never fallen out." So cute.
Yeah, you're pulling for them.
You are. Well, we're going to get beyond the shopping because to reduce Mary's tenure as First Lady to just shopping would do her a disservice. With the Civil War waging on, she did feel like it was her duty to go to the military hospitals. The newspapers admitted that she visited more than any other lady in Washington. Once, when visiting after soldiers had their legs amputated, Mary remained, even as most of the other ladies who had come with fled the hospital because of the smell. It was just too much for them, but not for Mary. She'd read to soldiers, deliver food, write letters for them. To quote the book, she raised $1,000 for the Christmas dinner at Douglas Hospital, and when there was a danger of scurvy, she provided through a personal donation of $1,000 lemon and oranges, and she made certain that unsolicited gifts of liquor to the White House went to the soldiers, end quote. So even if Mary's not doing the real nursing, which she would not have been expected to do, I think we can say that she was doing her part for the war effort.
And that's a side of her that the newspapers will always attack her for an extravagant ball or the French wallpaper before they'll point out that she's also doing that.
Speaking of the war, and you've already alluded to this, something out of Mary's control that was fueling her unpopularity was her links to the Confederacy. Her Southern heritage, including that unmistakable Southern drawl, had made her a target of suspicion. Some even accusing her of being a spy, despite her unwavering loyalty to her husband and the Union. But Mary was not helped by the fact that many of her Todd half-siblings fought for the Confederacy. So it was there's 14 living Todd children. 8 of those supported or fought for the Confederacy. 2 died in war, including her favorite half-brother Alec, and another, David Todd, was known for torturing Union soldiers at the head because he was the head of the head of a Confederate POW camp. Not great.
In Mississippi, right? That's true.
Not great. One of her Confederate half-sisters did stay at the White House during the war, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit. But on the whole, Mary would not and could not forgive the Todds who had been on the opposite side of the war. She's never one to let go of a grudge. She was said to have proclaimed, quote, "They would kill my husband if they could and destroy our government."
Which is not incorrect.
Nope. So even with Mary's growing unpopularity, her parties at the White House became highly coveted events. You've already alluded to that. Her great charm and intellect also made her a really wonderful hostess for parties at the White House. She was born to do this. Those who met her remarked upon her good manners, her ability to converse with everybody, sometimes even in French, and just the way that she made guests feel special, which is a gift. Not everybody has those people skills. And that's where Mary really excelled, even more than her husband. It's easy to overlook this or downplay it, but Mary played her role as First Lady in these parties to perfection. At one event I already mentioned, Mary tried to shake hands with every guest there, even when she was feeling unwell, which she suffered from migraines and a few other health issues. She still powered through and attended most events. The book notes that even Lincoln's secretaries, who were much younger than Mary, took more time off than she did. Up until the very end, Mary's energy rarely deserted her. And Mary was not above fighting others within the cabinet to throw certain parties, which I've already mentioned that she stole a party that was one typically thrown by the Secretary of State for the diplomatic corps. Mary was always suspicious of Secretary of State Seward because, as Matt mentioned, he had been a front runner for the Republican Party's ticket. So she used the opportunity to put Seward in his place, and eventually Mary won out.
Mm-hmm.
As silly as it sounds, Mary felt that she was fighting battles for her husband. This wasn't just about a party. It was what the party represented. And she'd always be on the hunt to sniff out any sense of disloyalty. I also think that the shopping, the parties, it all went to fill a void because she was lonely for most of the White House years. Her husband's attention on the war. When Lincoln did grace her with his presence, he was moody, depressed. It was because of his melancholy that after Christmas of 1862, Mary decided to throw a party. She wanted a diversion for her husband, but it also showed that the government was still there, still powerful. It represented something, of course. It would also get her name in the papers, hopefully. Fingers crossed, with good reviews. 500 invites went out, and Mary ordered champagne. The party occurred on February 5th, 1862, and it was a success. It was a triumph. It was tasteful, beautiful, showed off Mary's exquisite taste. The band played the Mary Lincoln polka, written for the party. Dinner didn't even begin until midnight, and guests stayed until the sun came up, even the generals, which, my God, as a 36-year-old, don't make me have dinner at midnight. The only reason I'm getting dinner at midnight is if I'm walking in my sleep. Otherwise, no.
Well, maybe an emergency trip through a Taco Bell drive-thru or something.
Oh, yeah, true.
It's different circumstances.
Yeah, a little hangover cure at midnight, yes, but a tasteful dinner, no. Unfortunately for her, Mary was unable to enjoy most of the party. Her and her husband that night alternated sitting at the bedside of their son, 11-year-old Willie. Young Willie was known to have been the child most like his father, funny in that off-the-cuff humor Abraham was known for, sweet, intelligent. It was said that he was Mary's favorite, her little boy. He called himself Mama's boy. And now he was really sick. His younger brother, Tad, also languished in his sick bed as well. Likely to have been typhoid fever caused by the unsanitary water from the Potomac that was sent into the White House. It sounds implausible today about unsanitary water being in the White House, but D.C. was essentially like living in a war camp. It had the same issues that we talked about in other episodes. The stagnant army, stagnant soldiers sitting around, it's breeding disease. And human waste is going into the Potomac. And when that human waste goes into the water, disease came into the White House. Just 2 weeks and a day after the party, Willie died. It was not an angelic, easy death either. The book says he died, quote, hard, end quote, from either internal hemorrhaging or ulceration of the intestine.
Oh.
After he had slipped into a coma. Yeah, it would have been really excruciating for anyone to see, let alone his parents. And this is the second son that the Lincolns had to bury. Mary never again set foot inside Willie's bedroom again, and she also wouldn't go to the bedside of her other son, Tad, who was still sick because it was too painful. Abraham, in his own act of grief, would spend every Thursday in Willie's old bedroom up until he was assassinated. This is where Mary's grief just overwhelmed her and the White House. She took to her bed for weeks, even as Tad continued to be ill. Tad would recover, though, unlike his older brother. When Mary got up from her bed in April, Mary found Tad's company too difficult as he reminded her too much of Willie. So for about a year, I don't want to say she avoided her child, but she really did. And she went to work removing traces of Willie from the White House. She sent his toys and clothes to Springfield, to family members. She just needed them out of the house. She did not want to be reminded of him. And this is where you already mentioned that she blamed herself for Willie's death, thinking that his death was a judgment from God for her party, for celebrating as the country was at war. And it's not just her who believed it. The book quotes a merchant in D.C. who said, so it's his quote, "I suppose Mrs. Lincoln will be providentially deterred from giving any more parties which scandalized so many good persons who did not get invites. Providence seems to have interfered to put a stop to any more parties at the White House this winter," end quote.
That scrutiny that she's under, it robs her of the chance to do what should be very natural, just to mourn the loss of her own child. But because the whole country is mourning the loss of their children, even that kind of compassion isn't available to her, because it just feels like what everybody else is going through, except they don't have the luxury of hosting balls and spending thousands of dollars of the public's money to spruce up their home, right? So she's just, no matter where she turns, it's a dead end.
Yeah, Lincoln himself kind of felt that it bonded him in a way to the men that were fighting for him, fighting for the Union. They had given a lot, they had lost a lot, and that this was sort of his sacrifice in a way. Am I saying that correctly?
That now he's had to pay the same way they have?
Kind of, or that he recognizes grief. He's already lost a son, but that this is, in some ways, just as FDR's, for going in the future, FDR's polio gives him the ability to relate to people in a way that he might not have before.
I think it's already a part. I think Lincoln already has a real capacity for seeing the depth of suffering. He's a pretty compassionate human being even before this.
Yeah.
But I think this deepens it, because then he has to wrestle with this trap himself, where he would like to mourn. He would like to detach. It is written a lot that Willie was like him, that he was precocious and extroverted and a kind of a prankster, and that he just brought a lot of joy to Lincoln's life. And Lincoln doesn't have the luxury of even really stopping to process, because the next day he has to deal, the telegrams will come in from the War Department.
Yeah, there's no stop to it. You can't pause a war and mourn.
Right. And I don't want to make him out to be saintly. Lincoln is a president. He's having to make some painful practical decisions. And ultimately, there are conversations Lincoln will have in 1964 with Grant, where clearly, not that I think this is fair to Grant. I do not think this is fair to Grant. But Lincoln starts to do some math about, well, how many more men can the Army of Northern Virginia really afford to lose and still cohere together as a viable military unit? Isn't there going to be a certain point at which just the math alone will bring the war to a conclusion
Yep.
in our favor. But that in turn means that he has to sort of coldly, analytically
I'm sacrificing.
see every casualty as just another number in what we would call a spreadsheet. And that's foreign to his nature, but it's kind of an approach to the war that he ends up taking because he knows that's the path to victory for the Union.
Mm-hmm. And for Mary, she falls into this way of thinking that whatever good transpired in her life, it would be followed by a fall. So we'll see that reoccur over the next few decades of her life.
Absolutely.
And it's after Willie's untimely death that Mary became fascinated with the growing spiritualist movement, likely introduced to it by her good friend and seamstress, Lizzie Keckley. Death all around them in a way that we, in the modern era, especially here in the United States, can't get our mind wrapped around it. It's not surprising that spiritualism exploded in popularity in this time. Lizzie Keckley had dove into spiritualism after the death of her own son, her only son, in the war. I don't know if you want to do a quick, just minute explanation of spiritualism.
It's kind of a hard thing to explain. In the American tradition, it has a lot of its roots in upstate New York in the burned over district where all sorts of religious revivals have their roots. This sounds bizarre because it's not what you would think would factor into this idea that you can communicate with the dead, but you almost have to imagine that you have this collision between these emergent theories of Darwinian change over time. Life evolves and there's cycles at work in nature, and then at the same time there's this belief in the soul. Eventually, after the Civil War, there will be attempts to try to photograph the soul or weigh the soul, measure the soul. Because to us, it seems like this weird kind of alchemy of there's some scientific rationalism in there, and there's some attempt to try to empirically measure things that we would consider immeasurable, but that at the same time, there's a lot of evangelical commitment to the idea that the body will be restored at the final judgment. That makes the carnage of the Civil War even harder for people to process, because every time you look at one of those photographic exhibits of the aftermath of a battle, you're asking yourself, is that my son in that picture? Is that my brother in that picture? I can't tell because I can't tell exactly what I'm looking at. What's happening in the middle of the 19th century is we're going through a religious revival called the Second Great Awakening. But we're also going through some revolutionary emerging ideas about biology and physics and electromagnetism.
They're like, if we can do those discoveries, why can't we figure out what's going on after somebody dies?
All right, why can't I photograph the soul leaving the body? Why can't I measure the soul? We would look at it today and say, well, that's not a falsifiable scientific hypothesis. That doesn't jive with our concept of reality. But this is a world where there's really widespread belief in bodily resurrection for a final judgment. And there's this sense that when someone is gone, maybe this is a little bit of Darwin and religious sensibility sort of interwoven. There's this sense that, well, maybe the soul keeps evolving on some other plane, and maybe it can communicate. And Mary Todd definitely gets drawn into that circle.
She threw seances in the White House, which even the president attended.
Yeah, Lincoln supposedly tried it out one time.
And there'd be plenty of visits from her new set of spiritualist friends. Mary really does become immersed in this spiritual world. It gave her solace in the fact that she felt like she could communicate with her sons. She told one of her many, many, many half-siblings once that, quote, Willie lives. He comes to me every night and stands at the foot of the bed with the same sweet, adorable smile he always had. He does not always come alone. Little Eddie is sometimes with him, end quote. She really uses spiritualism to cope with the immense grief of losing two sons.
Right.
And it would continue to provide her with comfort as her life spiraled further into chaos amid death and loss. You can understand that in a lot of ways, especially as she gets older and more things happen. The spirit realm holds more promise and company than Mary's real life.
I think it's important to remember, too, that she's not alone in doing this.
No, this is a big movement.
Right. And part of it is because during the Civil War, parents don't get to go through the normal ritual of a grieving process, which, remember, we're in a part of human history where many parents know what Mary is going through. Many children don't survive to adulthood, but at least you have the ritual of a wake and a funeral and a chance to say goodbye. Whereas during the Civil War, instead, you're simply going to get a letter in the mail that says,
Sorry,
we can't find your son. We can't find your husband. We think we know what became of him, but we just don't know. So some people go into just abject denial, and they assume that at some point
they're going to come home.
Their son or their brother or their father is going to knock on the door. Other people take to spiritualism as a way to try and find some closure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And for Mary and for many people, spiritualism offered more comfort than, just the run-of-the-mill religion did. She trusted clairvoyance to provide information from beyond.
She wouldn't be the last first lady to do that, by the way.
Oh, really? Well, I know that she would hear about Confederate plans, and she would run and find Abraham Lincoln and tell him about these Confederate plans, or who in the cabinet she thought was betraying him.
And Lincoln had some generals who probably would have been really benefited by some supernatural guidance. So
McClellan.
Right. He doesn't really have the team in place that will enable him to deliver victory until
late,
the middle of 64.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what other first lady used clairvoyance?
Nancy Reagan in the 1980s.
Nancy. I would not have expected Nancy.
Yeah.
I would have thought she would have thought that was satanic or something.
No, her clairvoyant's name was, I believe, Madam Quigley, Joan Quigley. Now, this is primarily astrology.
Okay.
But if the story is to be believed, after the assassination attempt on Ronald Reagan, which breaks the 0-year curse, if we want to get back into superstition, every president until Ronald Reagan, who was elected in a 0-year, died in office. That's supposedly Tecumseh's curse on William Henry Harrison that allegedly is visited down upon every future 0-year president until you get to Ronald Reagan, who survives his assassination attempt. But yeah, she routinely, once or twice a month, Nancy Reagan would consult with Madam Quigley. And just as Mary Todd faced accusations from Lincoln's staff that she was too influential and was dabbling in politics, there are many stories of Nancy Reagan clashing with Reagan's cabinet too. So who knows? Maybe it was history repeating itself.
Possibly. But you can understand why people close to Lincoln were not thrilled with her hearing this information from clairvoyance and then telling him and expecting him to do something. Later, after Lincoln's death, which we'll talk about, Mary would go and get a photograph taken where the ghostly image of Abraham Lincoln lurked behind her. He has his hands on her shoulders. You can see this photograph today. You can look it up. I'll probably put it out on the Instagram. But yeah, and focusing on spiritualism versus more traditional religion, Mary would be putting another target on her back. She has a lot of them at this point.
And I can give us kind of a little shadow of closure to this. Just if we could teleport ourselves back to 1859 or 1860, you would see graveyards, but oftentimes they would be 2 or 3 graves near someone's home, or maybe a dozen or so graves in a church. But the idea that there would be a state or federally subsidized cemetery that would have, 600 headstones, 1,000 headstones, that was just absolutely unthinkable, right? So you come back to that same America 10 years later, and those places are all over the place. And then just guess, what percentage of Civil War Union dead do you suppose they were not able to identify?
Oh, probably a huge amount. 75.
That's actually higher, but it's almost half.
Oh, wow.
So imagine just you're walking through the cemetery and you're like, okay, every other stone
Doesn't have a name.
marks someone who died in the war who we don't know. And now ask yourself, okay, so that person may have had a spouse, they had parents, they may have had children.
They had somebody.
And there's your spiritualism right there. There's your seances.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so we are in the middle of the war now.
So in 1862, soon after Willie died, one of Mary's younger half-sisters, Emily Todd Helm, whose Confederate soldier husband died in battle, she came and she stayed at the White House for a time. I already mentioned this. Controversially, when Emily crossed the Union lines to return to Illinois, she refused to swear allegiance. She was given a pass from Lincoln that she should have been allowed her entry into Illinois as long as she swore allegiance to the Union. Did not do that. Lincoln supposedly responded, "Bring her to me." Both sisters were grieving at the time, Mary for Willie, Emily for her husband. So they were bonded through the worst kind of human experience. They did their best to avoid talking politics, and Abraham Lincoln attempted to keep the woman's presence in the White House on the down low, wanted it to be as quiet as possible, knowing that a Confederate staying at the White House would not look great to the general public or those fighting for the Union. At one point, Emily yelled at a Union general who had been visiting the White House, saying, quote, "If I had 20 sons, they would all be fighting yours." Which, that's big yikes. Read the room, Emily.
Know where you are.
The Todds, they're all alike in that aspect. They are what they are. They don't read the room. They explode in anger. That's what made Mary such a Todd. Eventually, Emily and her children did leave the White House in 1863 of her own decision. And she would fall out with the Lincolns spectacularly when she wrote a letter to the president blaming him and Mary for the deaths of her husband and one of her brothers. As we have said, Mary's capacity to hold a grudge was earth-shattering. She would not forgive her sister for this letter, and the two never wrote or saw each other ever again.
I don't expect her to.
No. That's the thing. They had been so generous to her, and Emily she was grieving. What is it? Hurt people. So you can understand her aspect in a little bit, but I really do feel for Mary, though, because she really needed her sister there. She loved having her sister there, even if she was a Confederate, because the grief remained raw from Willie's death. She had her spiritualist friends and Lizzie Keckley to keep her company, but her family, through death and disownment, was dwindling, and her husband perpetually occupied with the war. I think the book puts it best when it says, quote, "The Lincolns were together more than they ever had been. At the same time, they're farther apart. To some extent, Lincoln had disappeared as a husband," end quote. When her husband was in Mary's company, he was often distracted and understandably frequently depressed. So if we're going back to assessing their marriage during this time, it seems that external circumstances, external stressors were significantly impacting the country, which would make sense. It would make sense that the president was devoting so much time and energy and emotional capacity to the war and its impacts on the country. He had to do that.
If he's in the telegraph office, if he's in the cabinet room, if he's greeting office seekers. If he's talking to the ambassador from Great Britain, he can't let his own guard down. He can't share his own authentic perspective on how, let's be honest, for the first half of the war, how horribly bad it's going, right? The one place where in theory he could let the facade down and really share his frustration and his anguish would be with Mary, but then she's trying to cope with the loss of Willie. And then, oh, by the way, Lincoln's trying to cope with the loss of Willie too. It's this crazy circle of pain that they just can't get out of.
I can't even imagine like losing a child amidst a civil war in which you're driving. It's not just that the nation's at war, you're leading it. The amount of stress that would cause. And I think I mentioned in the first episode, we know now how much losing a child impacts a couple's relationship. So many couples divorce after losing a child. The number's astronomical. It all makes sense, but it also doesn't discount Mary's feeling of isolation. She had once been his political advisor. Now she's sidelined, she's mourning, and she filled her days with shopping, traveling, spending time with friends, and visiting the war hospitals. At one point, she chastised Lincoln for sending too short of a telegram when she was away, saying that she hoped for at least, quote, one line to say we are occasionally remembered, end quote.
Ouch.
Which is classic Mary. It's classic passive aggressiveness.
It's the text that just says, okay. And then
Yeah.
suddenly, oh no, am I in trouble?
Hers would be like, ... and then it would be a huge text that she had typed out. She hated the idea of being forgotten or abandoned. The couple, though, must not have been too distant because at one point there were rumors of Mary being pregnant again. She was not. I mean, it's not as if they weren't spending any time together. Mary must have hoped that once the war ended and once they left the White House with no more political ambitions on the horizon, they would finally, at last, have the time together that she so desired. That's the ultimate hope of so many couples after years of child rearing and working. Robert was already a young man and Tad would be older at that point. Mary could have Abraham all to herself.
Oh, you're painting a nice picture here.
But, of course, sadly, fate would have other plans for the Lincolns. 1865 had started so optimistically. Abraham Lincoln had been reelected in November of 1864, overwhelmingly. He won every state but 3.
Right. There's still problems to solve, and his party is very divided, but he doesn't have to worry about re-election, and the war looks like it's going to end in a Union victory. It's just kind of a matter of time.
Yeah, exactly. And Mary's happy at the win because she always loved winning, but she did fear what would happen next ever since Willie's death. Again, she felt that anything good happened would be followed by tragedy. Abraham Lincoln had had some premonitions, some weird dreams of violence happening, that he would have won 2 terms, but he wouldn't finish it. So Mary actually ordered $1,000 worth of mourning clothes to be prepared. This is before the assassination.
That's creepy.
However fearful Mary was by the spring, like you said, it was clear that the Union had, at long last, won the war. In the beginning, many, including the Lincolns, had expected the war to last months, not years. And now, finally, the bloodshed would stop and the country become whole again. Mary would be with Abraham and Tad to go visit Virginia in late March of 1865. There would be a presidential review of the troops and a parade. Mary and Julia Grant, the wife of Union General Ulysses S. Grant, had been in a carriage, running late for the review of the troops, no thanks to really bad roads. Mary lost her damn mind. She lost her temper at the idea of missing the event, yelling at the driver, the horses, Julia. Poor Julia Grant was stuck there getting yelled at. Mary even attempted to get out and walk through the mud, but that proved too much for her. When the carriage made it, the event had already started. Incensed that they had not waited for her and that one of the other generals' wives was alongside her husband. Mary made a very public and very embarrassing scene in front of the entire high command of the Army of the Potomac as she yelled at her husband, the president. We get an account of it from an officer. This account was written later, but it does match up with some other accounts that we know. So I think we could say generally this is what happened. Quote from the officer, Mrs. Lincoln repeatedly attacked her husband in the presence of officers. He bore it as Christ might have done, with an expression of pain and sadness that cut to the heart, but with supreme calmness and dignity. He called her mother with his old-time plainness. He pleaded with eyes and tones till she turned on him like a tigress, and then he walked away, hiding that noble, ugly face that we might not catch the full expression of its misery. End quote.
Boy, that is unsparing.
Yeah, not a great moment for Mary. And she knew it. She hid for the next couple of days. She hid herself. She did not go out. She said she was feeling unwell, but shame had set in. And a few days later, she ended up leaving to go back to the White House, leaving Tad with his father. It was just a few weeks later, on April 14th, that the president and the first lady decided to take in a show, Our American Cousin, at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. Mary had had a migraine that day, but Lincoln wanted to go out and enjoy the theater. He had been ground down, to say the least, by the war, and with it over, he wanted a diversion. Mary, being Mary, could not refuse. Robert Lincoln decided against going, and the Grants refused as well, but Major Henry Rathbone and his fiancée, Clara Harris, filled in.
We should point out that we have another podcast that explores this. Put a little plug in.
If you want more details about the assassination plot itself, about all this, please see our previous episode that we did to mark the 160th anniversary of the assassination, because I'm not going to dwell on the ins and outs of it here, because we already have it. We already have a podcast. So if you want more, or hopefully maybe you've already listened to that, I am just going to do the broad strokes because of that. Before the play, the president and the first lady had gone for a ride in a carriage alone, just the two of them, which was rare. There's usually other people with them. They spoke about their future and what it would hold for them. Surely they must have thought they had made it through the worst of it, with Willie gone and the war now done. They must have felt like they were finally coming out the other side. Instead, we enter the most famous and often told chapter of Mary Todd Lincoln's life. Like I said, not going into the details. We're going to keep it focused on Mary's point of view. For Mary, she was holding her husband's hand at the theater. She had joked to him about what the others in the box would think to see her hanging on to him. And right after that, in a moment in the play with the greatest laughter, John Wilkes Booth, a Confederate sympathizing actor, shot Abraham Lincoln in the back of the head. Mary, as expected, responded in hysterics. "Oh my God, and have I given my husband to die?" she repeated. She became bereft at one point in the chaos when she had been separated from her dying husband, screaming, "Where is my husband? Why didn't he kill me? Why was I not the one?" It's just heart-wrenching hearing those words even a century and a half later. I'm going to try to get through this. I'm going to take a deep breath.
And I do have one thing to share when we get Lincoln across the street that I hope doesn't totally shut you down, because it's a little detail that doesn't always make it into the descriptions of this event.
I'm going to try to get through it without crying a little bit. When they finally carried Lincoln to the house across Ford's Theater, Peterson House, Mary followed, her evening gown drenched in blood. She said it was her husband's blood, but it was actually Henry Rathbone's when he attempted to manhandle John Wilkes Booth after the gunshot. We know that the crowd of men had to pull Mary off of Abraham as she kept flinging herself on him and kissing him, hoping to God that he would wake up from his injury. He never did. Over the course of the 9 hours it took the president to die, Mary waited mostly alone, sometimes joined by her eldest son, Robert, and others, including one of her friends, Elizabeth Dixon, who had gotten to Peterson House around midnight. She had sent for Lizzie Keckley, but there was a mix-up with the address, and she never arrived. Continually, Mary had to be dragged away from the bed as she tried to kiss her husband. There's this line in the book that just kills me, quote, begging him to wake up and trying, as had often been necessary during their marriage, to catch his attention through some extravagant gesture, end quote. Despite the tragedy and trauma that Mary had just lived through, as she had been there at the very act of violence, unlike many of the men in the room, her hysterics made them uncomfortable and irritated. At some point in the early hours of Saturday, Mary had collapsed after crying, "Oh, have I given my husband to die?" And it's when she's out of consciousness, so she's in some kind of terrible slumber of exhaustion and sorrow, that the President of the United States, the man who had led the country through the Civil War, her love, her husband, he died at around 7 a.m.
So brace yourself. You know that the Keckley source is considered pretty reliable.
Yeah.
And one of the things that scholars, the professionals, not amateurs like us, whenever they can find a quote that's attributed to somebody, they always want to figure out, well, if we can find this quote in a source that was partisan in favor of the subject, and we can also find this quote in a source that appears to have been kind of hostile to the subject, if we can find a friend and an enemy saying the same thing, then we're pretty sure it's probably true. And you know the Herndon source is never very kind to Mary. Obviously, that the Keckley source usually is, but they both report that moments after she's told that he's dead, and bear in mind, Stanton has, as you just indicated, as you just explained, has pushed her out of the room.
Yeah, she's done. They're like, get this woman out.
So supposedly she looks at her hands and she thinks about the fact that, you know, just about 12 hours earlier, she was nervous that in holding her husband's hand that the public would once again ridicule her for acting inappropriate for her age. And then now he's gone, and supposedly she just kind of stares blankly into space and says, they wouldn't even let me hold his hand when he died.
Oh, no. Oh, no.
And then she just walks out of the room, just completely hollowed out by the experience, as you would expect.
And now I'm crying. We talk so much about the political ramifications of Lincoln's death, how it impacted Reconstruction, but I do think it's good to take a pause here as I'm crying to reflect on the very real human costs. It's a national trauma, but it's a very personal trauma. She just had to see her husband die in a very violent way up close.
And it's happened to her again, right? Because when Willie is lost, he's unconscious, he's in pain, he's not able to explain what he's going through. And the only person to whom she can talk that understands what it was like to feel that helpless is her husband. And now he's gone too.
Yeah. I just think it's good to, like, these are real people who all had the same emotions, hopes, dreams as we do. They're not characters in a book or playthings in a game. Again, we talk about the political side of Lincoln's death, but this is a woman who's going through the most personal of tragedies.
And now, to foreshadow where we'll go next, it probably won't be in this episode, but you now need to realize that I think, just to kind of plant this for the next discussion that we have, we're all going to learn that Robert is not going to be sympathetic or supportive or compassionate towards his mom.
No.
But there's a theory that one of the reasons he can't be is because if he allows himself for a moment,
think of everything he's gone through,
to feel 10% of what she's feeling, that's it. He won't be able to survive it either.
Yeah.
So again, no matter where she turns,
She can't find comfort.
There's just no escape.
Yeah. Well, since I've already cried, I think that's probably a good place.
You weren't supposed to cry during the podcast. That's not supposed to happen.
I know. I was not expecting. It took me a while to write the script because there's so much tragedy between Willie and Lincoln's death. I've written everything out and I've gone through her whole life and there's more tragedy, but I was dreading it, but I didn't cry. Luckily, you guys can't see me, but you might have heard a little bit of some sniffles. I do think for my emotions, I think this is a good place to stop, and we will pick up next time to finish the rest of Mary's life between her life after the assassination, her famous insanity trial, which is probably the other major thing she's known for. And of course, we will be with her until the very end.
I'm going to say I look forward to that, but I know you can't really say I look forward to that, but it is a fascinating story. I think about the fact that this is the end of our second podcast on Mary Todd Lincoln, but if this little nugget doesn't pique people's interest, I'm not sure what would. Her insanity trial, quote unquote trial, if my memory is correct, you could squeeze 12 of them into one of our episodes because she has all of 10 minutes to try to keep herself out of an institution. She has very little agency.
Nope. She doesn't even testify at it.
Doesn't even get a chance to speak on her own behalf.
Yeah. It's rough, which is why I was putting out writing the script, because it was like, it's only going downhill from here. I told you, high water mark is pretty much right when she gets in the White House, and it goes downhill from there. I'm too soft. I'm too soft for this. So I can't even imagine having to live through this. So I will sign off and thank you guys for listening. We appreciate all the likes, the ratings, and everything. If you want to look for when the next episode will drop, please follow us on Instagram. I make reels to go along with each episode. That's where you can always see who's coming up next, we will be covering, as well as when episodes drop. You will hear first there. So
Erin is not a graphic designer, but you would never know that when you look at those reels.
You're too sweet.
No, they are very cool.
Well, you're too sweet. All right. Well, bye, guys.
We'll see you next time.
Bye.